Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Literally No Subtext, where ironically I'm going to be analysing the subtext of one of my most recent type trend polls that I posted on my Instagram page. If you are unfamiliar with my type trend polls, the premise of this social experiment, as I will call it, is that I'll post a question to my Instagram followers, usually one every month, sometimes two in a month. And it'll be something like, what's your favorite? No, I've never posted a favorite actually. What's your biggest fear? Or what gives you energy? Or, how do you define success? Something generic that people can have like a broad range of answers to. And my followers will, if they wish to participate, answer, including their type in the answer, and then I will go through the answers in my inbox. I'll analyze trends between the types and I'll come up with an informal analysis of my findings based on the trends that I've seen within the answers of a particular type, or across the board with all types, or between sensors versus intuitors, or introverts versus extroverts, etc., etc. So today I'm presenting the findings for a recent poll, which was, where do you get your sense of identity? And it was a very interesting one. I've already posted this on my Instagram page. It is still there. It is the first post that I posted that wasn't an Instagram story. So you can go find the summarized dot points on there. But today I'm going to be expanding on some of the dot points that I had and going through each type pool one by one actually, and explaining to you what general responses of that type pool were saying. So without further ado, we'll jump in. So for this test pool, I got 171 answers in total. 22% of them were from sensors and 77% of them were from intuitives. Obviously, this is not a totally fair pool, as the number of applicants aren't evenly distributed across all 16 types, which is pretty standard. Usually I will get fewer responses from sensors, but the interest in this topic being skewed heavily towards intuitive types loosely implies that intuitives are more likely to have thought about this topic or are more willing to sit down and think about this topic. So other points of interest are the INFJs provided our biggest pool of answers at 15% of all answers, with ENFPs following closely at 14% of all answers. The smallest pool was from the ESTJs, which is pretty standard at this point, and I just received one answer from our ESTJs. The general thought is that TE DOMs aren't likely to spend a lot of time answering these kinds of polls or checking Instagram or flipping through Instagram stories, especially ones with long explanations, as I usually put up on my Instagram. Obviously, there would be exceptions to this rule, but the fact that they are like almost always my smallest pool implies that there is some truth to that, and I guess this is just because they don't consider that a necessarily productive use of time, and they probably are likely to want to be up in the world getting tasks done, getting things done, especially ESTJs with their SI second as opposed to ENTJs with their NI second. In fact, I did get quite a few more answers from ENTJs in this poll, but we'll get there in a second. By the way, if you're new to this terminology, NI, SI, what I'm referring to there with these abbreviations are two of the 8 cognitive functions, which is terminology that stems back to Carl Jung's work in the 1920s, and Isabel Cook Briggs and Catherine Briggs Myers picked up his work and developed it into this system of 4-letter codes, which we can use to work out what our dominant 4 cognitive functions are that we use most of the time. I'm not going to go into that all right now, but if you are interested in more about the cognitive functions, I will put links in the description of this podcast, and I would recommend that you dive into that before listening, maybe. Please feel free to listen anyway. I will be using, MBTI cognitive function jargon in this podcast, but the general findings that I have for each of the types will still be digestible whether you understand the terminology or not. But as I've always said, it is always good, if we are going to use a tool, as Myers-Briggs is, that we understand exactly where the tool comes from. And if we're going to disregard it, we should understand what it is first and foremost. So in my opinion, it's good to dive into those functions, because if we use the Myers-Briggs system without understanding the functions, it can actually be quite dangerous, because we then put people in boxes. We place dichotomies on people and put them in boxes that imply if they're an intuitor, they can't also be a sensor. But the cognitive functions stipulate that we actually use all 4 of those letters, T, F, S, N, just in different orders, meaning we have different preferences of them. Okay, this is not a podcast of me explaining this, but there's a lot of nuance to it, so please dive into the links in the description. Anyway, let's push on. 8% of people wrote some variation of I don't know in that they hadn't thought about their identity, or they didn't know where it came from, or it was too big a question for them to actually come up with an answer for. The only types who didn't write I don't know at all were INFPs, ENTPs, and ENFJs. Not really a lot to be said for that. It's not like we can draw a particular trend there. That's just how it came out. 19% of people wrote that they got their identity from their religion. That was one of the most common trends across the board. It was by far the biggest pool of commonality between the types, so I thought that was interesting. I'm also going to, when I go into each of the type pools, I'm going to explain how many of them wrote that they got their identity from religion and how many of them wrote I don't know, just as an interesting case study. So we're going to start with all 4 of our high TI users. TI is an abbreviation for the cognitive function introverted thinking. So ENTPs first. Generally speaking, I found that ENTPs were happy not to label themselves. It could be because of their polar, blind spot, trickster, FI, which maybe stipulates they don't need that sense of personal identity in the same way that maybe the FI DOMs would, but we'll get into that. By the way, everything that I speculate in this podcast is just speculation. I'm not saying anything definitive about the types. I'm just drawing lines between dots that seem to be vaguely presenting themselves. So with ENTPs, they had a very vague sense of identity. I don't think there was much overlap in the answers. They didn't use words such as values and likes, rather what they learn from books, what they learn from other people, what ideas they can get from books, and those that they speak to. The general sentiment was that they placed emphasis on knowledge and understanding new things about the world, and that they got their identity from their ability to understand and to speculate and to learn things. That was the general consensus with ENTPs. I'll note that one ENTP wrote that they found their identity from their religion, and no ENTPs wrote that they didn't know. Our INTPs also placed emphasis on what they know and the fact that they are appreciated for what they know and their ability to know things and understand things. A few of them wrote that they got their sense of identity from their intelligence. So there was the recurring theme of learning, having debates, the ability to problem solve, their willingness to learn. These were all repeated ideas within the pool of the INTP answers. One wrote, I think, therefore I am, which was an answer also written by an ISTP. So there's that TI idea of knowledge being identity as opposed to values being identity. 3 INTPs wrote that they found identity from their religion, and 3 INTPs wrote that they don't know where they get their sense of identity from. Moving on to ISTPs, so they also share TI, introverted thinking, as their first function, as do INTPs. Their second function is extroverted sensing, however, as opposed to INTPs, whose second function is extroverted intuition. So I only got about 5 answers from ISTPs. As I said, don't usually get many answers from S-types for these, especially for these kind of abstract questions. So the answers from the ISTPs, I'll just say them all because they're enough for me to say them all. They were: 1, I am who I want to be, and that comes from what makes sense to me. 2, I am just who I am, and that's that. 3, my faith in God and also future me. 4, my hobbies and how I get along with people. And 5, I think, therefore I am. The only pattern to be drawn here is that there is a total lack of emotion in these responses, or more specifically, kind of emotionally driven judgment in terms of how things make them feel, which is obviously because their introverted judging tool, their personal judging tool, is a thinking one, not a feeling one. With ESTPs, I only got 2 responses, and they were: 1, good question, let me get back to you, and 2, what identity, man? Now, the obvious trend is that not a lot of thought has gone into the topic because they've either answered I don't know or not answered at all. This is likely because introverted thinking, TI, which is their second function, is not a function concerned with personal identity per se, the way that FI is. And their dominant function, SE, extroverted sensing, keeps them highly engaged in the present, tangible moment, which means that they're less inclined to introspect about such things. Again, generally speaking. Doesn't mean, and this is classic, a classic stereotype about SE DOMs is that they're not intelligent or haven't thought or don't think. That's not the case at all. It's just that their preference is to be immediately engaged in the sensory world in front of them. So if there's an option to sit for 5 minutes and think about what their identity comes from versus getting up and doing something that's interesting to them, they're probably going to choose the latter like 99% of the time. So the fact that they use SE first and TI second, does this mean that ESTPs are the types who are least likely to think about their identity in the way that is required for this question? Quite likely. Moving on to our FI users. FI means introverted feeling. It's an introverted judging function. I definitely expected that I was going to get some really solid FI answers, given this sort of stereotype that FI is really associated with personal identity. We, of course, the thing to be understood about FI is that, yeah, there is a sense of personal identity, but this could largely be because their emotional experience being introverted is not attached to the tribe whatsoever. So they're placing a lot of value on their individual, independent emotional experience. And so their personal feelings, their personal values, they're going to fight for, and they would associate that with who they are very much. So I think there's an amplified sense of, because introverted feelers are so emotionally feelsy within them, identity is really important to them. But I'm sure that identity is equally important to all the types. It's just that with FI DOMs especially, you'd see it come out in a much more obvious way, because not only is it like the thing that they're using to judge everything, those innate sense of values, they're also not taking into consideration naturally all the time the harmony of the tribe. So they're kind of just going to be unapologetically, generally speaking, again, they're going to be sort of like unapologetically gun-ho about those values and who they are, and I am who I am and I don't care what you have to say about it, basically. So let's dive into the answers. We'll start with our ENFP. So this was the second largest pool. There was a general focus on being cheerful, making people laugh, being authentic. Authenticity, it was a word that came up a lot. Having an open mind, which is hugely NE, obviously. Exploring, imagination, and creativity. So all of those answers are very NE. FI, for sure, there's that idea of just like exploration of ideas and the self. But then FI being like how they feel about things and wanting to make other people feel a type of way about things too. Huge FI values named, such as passion, people, where I'm from, what I love to do, finding what brings me joy, finding self-worth, hobbies, significant other, my feelings, my creativity, desires, beliefs, being unique, heartfelt conversations, self-love. These are all examples. These are all actual responses that I got. I noticed a few, specifically 6 ENFPs, wrote that their identity came from how other people perceived them. This might stem from the FI desire to present as the most authentic version of themselves and to feel understood. The need to feel understood was also a common answer, which is very FI. One ENFP wrote, I get my identity from the sense of worth that I get when I prove to others that I'm original. The idea that I mentioned from the ENTP pool about getting ideas from what they see in books also came through, as 2 ENFPs wrote about seeing themselves in the characters they read about in books. This was important to note, as I did not find this answer in any other pool. So this could be an NE tendency, potentially. But again, only 2 people said it, so... 7 ENFPs named their religion as their sense of identity, and 1 ENFP wrote that they don't know and also mentioned that this question caused them an identity crisis. With our INFPs, the presence of the FI values and feelings were equally present in their answers, with such answers being, when I act consistent with what's important to me, I feel like myself, or moral choices, things I like, the way I treat people, my ability to love, my strong opinions, my work of art, my passions, my interests, my feelings. Do you see the heavy amount of emotion that's in these responses as opposed to our TI answers? Very similar overlaps with the ENFP pool, only there was much less emphasis on exploration and more emphasis on the self with the INFP answers. 5 INFPs named their religion as their source of identity, and 0 INFPs said that they didn't know, which I found interesting. The stereotype is that INFPs do have a very secure sense of self, so maybe that's why 0 of them didn't know. Moving on to our ESFPs, I only had 6 answers from them. 2 of them listed religion, the other 4 listed similar FI values to the ones I mentioned for ENFPs and INFPs. Specifically, I'll again list the answers because there's only 6 of them. Well, 2 of them listed their religion, and these are the other 4. 1, my moral compass. 2, feelings that I feel versus feelings I don't. Courage versus fear. 3, values, religion, experience, and art. And 4, I am the sum of my environment. Obviously, that last answer is quite SE, but again, we don't really have enough information here to draw solid conclusions. With our ISFPs, I got 10 answers for ISFPs, so they were one of the bigger sensor pools, and that's usually enough to find some patterns. So what I found was there were heavy FI words such as from within me, soul searching, my interests, staying true to my ideals, helping others, hopes and dreams, random things that I like, core values, and hobbies. But the answers weren't as extensive as their FI-DOM counterparts, the INFPs. In fact, a few answers indicated that this question had never been thought about before, as opposed to the INFPs who all knew how to answer. In contrast, the ISFPs listed dot point answers but didn't elaborate, and those who didn't know didn't put across existential crisis vibes. They just seemed to shrug, say, I don't know, I'm just kind of here, haven't really thought about it. That was a legitimate response that I got, and move on. So this is likely because their auxiliary SE keeps them present in the physical world, as I was saying before, rather than spending time in that NE that makes them able to see patterns, connections, and meaning in the abstract. 4 ISFPs listed religion as their source of identity. 2 ISFPs said they don't know, which means we can't attribute a firm sense of identity to the presence of FI in and of itself, though this was confirmed by the fact that neither the ENFJ nor the ENTP pool had I don't know responses as well. So moving on to our FE users, starting with ENFJs. Most ENFJs incorporated others into their responses. Obviously, they use FE, extroverted feeling first, which is a function that experiences its emotional judgments as attached to the tribe rather than separate from the tribe. So their responses were very others focused. For instance, being a bright light in the lives of others, the impact I have on people, how others see me, to help others and improve for others, being with my friends, doing good deeds, and making the world a better place. So these are obviously heavy extroverted feeling type answers, as FE cannot help but take into account the emotional state of the tribe and how all actions and choices have consequences for the tribe, as opposed to introverted feeling, which is a much more subjective and personal emotional experience that can exist separately from the tribe, as I said before. The ENFJ's second function, NI, introverted intuition, was not super obvious in these answers, except for the ones that mentioned some kind of bigger picture that they're fighting for, i.e. making the world a better place and the general larger impact that I have on the world. 6 ENFJs named their faith as their source of identity, and as I said, 0 ENFJs wrote I don't know, and this pool was literally the same size as the INFP pool. Our INFJs, as I said before, were our biggest pool. There were similar FE-driven responses such as helping people, how others perceive me, bringing good to the world, the people who trust me, being there for my friends, my optimism, being kind. One person wrote, I've had to work really hard to find an identity separate from others' opinions. Again, this is an external feedback-driven response rather than a personal response, which would be a detached from the tribe if they used introverted feeling. The NI came in with a contemplation of bigger picture concepts, though it was done in a way that still worked with FE. For instance, knowing God loved me before I was born, investigating truth, showing people there's still hope, creating real change, being able to see where everyone's coming from despite our different ideas, my philosophy and set of ideas. There is a kind of zoomed out look at life in these answers while still focused on relationships and others. So it's that NIFE concept of the world needs to change, but in order for that to happen, people need to change. Now, 6 INFJs listed their religion as their source of identity, and 5 INFJs wrote, I don't know. So those were our NIFE types. Now we'll move on to our NITE users. So first we have the ENTJs. As I said before, not a lot of DOM-TE responses to analyze. There were only 6 answers from ENTJs, which weren't enough to draw too many patterns. 2 ENTJs listed their passions, which is not surprising given that they are FI, introverted feeling users. As their fourth function, they use introverted feeling. 3 out of 6 of ENTJs named their accomplishments as a source of identity, which is very TE, extroverted thinking. I'm also going to read out a message that I got from one of my ENTJ followers who commented on the lack of ENTJ responses that I mentioned in my findings from the poll. As an ENTJ, I can speak for why there are not many answers to the identity question. ETJs with their FI last are not comfortable with exploring their identity in the first place. They know what it is but can't really explain. I thought about this question and answered, I don't think listing a few things can sum up my identity. I know what is and is not a part of my identity, but I can't think of anything that sufficiently defines it in a few words. For good measure, I'm also going to include an ESTJ message that I got in response to the same findings from the poll. ESTJ here, while discomfort may be a factor, it is not the only reason. ESTJs at least, potentially ENTJs also, are dominant TE and are very work-oriented types. Often we ESTJs don't slow down enough to respond to a social media post because it is not a productive activity. Speaking for myself at least, I find it difficult to take the time to do unproductive things. A healthy ESTJ knows firmly where their identity is and also makes time for rest. However, an unhealthy or somewhat unhealthy ESTJ will find their identity in their work or something they've accomplished and often will not take time to rest. So this kind of confirms what I was saying earlier about TE DOMs, and thank you to those 2 followers who submitted those answers. All right, moving on to our INTJs. And yes, I have got a section for the INTJs in this podcast as opposed to the Instagram post, which one of my followers pointed out that I did not include any reference to INTJs in the Instagram post. So here we go. Their answers were very focused on purpose, principles, work, and an attachment to what could be in the future, which is very NI, introverted intuition. So some of the answers were, who I will be in the future, anger at what prevents the world from becoming what it could/should be, wanting to be a good role model for future generations, how much I'll be able to achieve in the future, knowing that God has a plan for me. I am a link in the chain of my ancestors. All of these are very big picture, future, ideal focused. No INTPs wrote about such big picture things, which shows you a difference between NE and NI. Also, as opposed to INTPs, INTJs listed FI value things like family, self-improvement, their significant other, their principles, their dignity, fighting to be independent. Of course, everyone values these things, but these polls and cognitive function understanding in general are all about what's the immediate first preference that the brain goes to when asked these questions. And if these kinds of things are the things that the person first thinks of, it points to certain preferences. So these aforementioned answers indeed indicate that they use FI, very focused on their internal values, as opposed to INTPs who generally didn't list personal values, but more their knowledge and ability to learn. Again, pointing to their preferences, not saying that neither type values each other's values. So this is a clear difference between feeling and thinking being used as introverted judging processes. To say this another way, TI users are using logic as their means of filtering and judging information internally. So they'll be asking, can I make sense of this thing? FI users are using their emotional ties as their means of filtering and judging information, so they'll be asking, does this thing feel right, or is it in line with my values? I'll note that ENTJs, even though I only had 6 answers from them, also wrote their personal passions and accomplishments, which are FI values, again pointed to the FI preference. And again, such answers did not appear in the NTP pool at all. 4 INTJs named their religion as their source of identity, and 2 INTJs wrote, I don't know. And finally, and I'm glad I'm saying finally because I can feel a lot of vocal fry in my voice, it is like 5 p.m. at the end of the day and I'm recording this at a time where I've already done filming for the day and my voice is pretty much carked it. So I only got 1 answer from ESTJs, which was giving my best and seeing that reflected in my good grades, etc. Obviously, this is not enough to draw a trend, but the answer definitely exemplifies TESI in that it is both functionality-based and this person clearly measures success through a smaller scale lens, such as getting good grades, as opposed to an NI user who would measure success through a much more futuristic, zoomed out lens. And then, of course, we also have that awesome answer from the ESTJ follower who gave us a bit more nuance, which we love. ISTJs were more respondent with 7 answers. We got 1 I don't know and 1 answer that listed religion as a source of their identity. Other answers had a slightly FI hue to them, which makes sense given that FI falls in the ISTJ's 3rd cognitive function slot. These answers included loving those around me, thoughts and actions, my morals, I guess, my life goals and hobbies, my favorite answer was learning my place in the human beehive, which may be the most TE response we have got to date. ESFJs gave us 3 answers. One wrote, I don't know, do I have one? With an exclamation mark and a question mark. The other 2 wrote, being a Christian and the other people around me, and heritage and family and friends. Obviously those point to FE, but again, not enough to draw trends. ISFJs were slightly more cooperative. I got 5 answers from them, with 3 answering their religion, 2 answering I don't know, and the other answered how others see me, which again fits into the FE bubble. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of the episode. Those were all the findings and the trends that I got from these answers. Again, we only had 171, so hopefully as time goes on we'll be able to get much more answers, greater pools, and be able to draw more accurate trends between the types. So if you made it this far, thanks so much for listening. Would love to know your thoughts, as this is the first type trend episode, so feel free to send me a message on Instagram to let me know what you thought of this episode. Please feel free to tune in for more episodes in the future. I'll be throwing up probably all of my Fridays content in audio format or reading the scripts for them on here, as well as some random other interviews, other thoughts as I've mentioned, and future type trend poll findings. So please feel free to jump on over to my YouTube channel if you haven't. It's called Dear Kristen if you liked what you heard today. And if you haven't followed me on Instagram, jump on over if you want to be part of future type trend pools. And if you haven't participated in the poll so far, please feel free to do so in the future. It'd be great to have your responses so that we can draw more accurate trends. On my Instagram page, I also throw up some of my favorite comments from each video that I release on YouTube, as well as other random adventures on there. So hope to see you next time, guys. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you around. Bye.